In this video, I'd like to talk about an alternative way of doing switching in your GNS3 topology by using the EtherSwitch-router. And if you want to practice iOS commands that relate to switches, this is what you're going to want to do. So, before we actually look at how to do this, let's talk about how do I get this into my topology in the first place. This is not a built-in node. This is a special iOS image support on a certain range of routers that give the routers this ability. So, how do we figure that out? Well, the first thing you're going to want to do is go to gns3.com and go ahead and log in. And then from there, you're going to want to click on Support, followed by Documentation. And then from here, click on where it says Adding iOS Images. We already saw this window before a couple of videos back when we were talking about what iOS images were suitable for GNS3. So I'm going to go back to that exact same document that we were looking at next time, which is viewable right here from where it says in this document. We're going to want to click on those words, which will bring up another document. Okay, so the EtherSwitch module is an actual module that goes in a network module slot within a router. So any of the routers that you see in this list that support NMs or network modules will support the EtherSwitch module. So for example, look at the 1700 series. It says it supports 2 sub-slots for Wix and no network slots. So if you get yourself a 1700 series iOS software image, you will not have access to the EtherSwitch module. So if we scroll down past all of these, past the 7200s at the bottom, it actually has a section right there on Cisco Catalyst switches. And it says that you can, as long as you can get an iOS image that supports the 2600s, 3600s, or 3700 series, then you will have access to the EtherSwitch module. In my particular example in this video, I'm going to be using a 3725 for the EtherSwitch. Now, one other thing that's important to know about this is notice that it says that the EtherSwitch module, because it's not a ASIC-based, a hardware-based switch like a Catalyst 6500 or a Catalyst 4500 or something like that, it's not going to support the full range of features that you would have in a real physical switch. And right here in this document, it actually tells you, if I zoom in here a little bit, these are all the features which are not supported by the EtherSwitch module. So there are quite a bit of them. And it's just a limitation of that particular module. Even if you had a real 3700 router and you had a real EtherSwitch module plugged into it, you would still have a serious limitation on these switches right here, on these various features. So there's a lot of stuff in here, and especially if you're a CCNA candidate, I want to point out some of the features that unfortunately are missing from this device that you are going to want to have some practice with if you can. So number one, and I'm sure it's somewhere here on this list, I just am not looking at it right now, but when it comes to trunking, 802.1q trunking, you're going to want to learn how to configure and monitor dynamic trunks that use DTP, the dynamic trunking protocol. So in a real switch, it would be switch port mode dynamic, and then you select auto or desirable. Switch port mode dynamic, auto or desirable. That's not available here. In the EtherSwitch module, all you can do is statically configure an interface as a trunk with switch port mode trunk. There is no dynamic option. Another thing, when it comes to ether channels, you can create ether channels in here, but you cannot create dynamic ether channels. So once again, with ether channel in a real switch, you have a choice if you want to of using either the port aggregation protocol or LACP. Once again, that would be like desirable or auto or something like that, passive, active. Those keywords also not available in the EtherSwitch module. When it comes to VTP, the VLAN trunking protocol, what I've noticed is that in real switches, and you'll see this in documentation, if one switch is configured with a VTP domain name and then it trunks with a second switch, there's a functional trunk here, and the second switch has no VTP domain name. It's empty, it's null. The second switch can learn of the VTP domain name from the first switch. That's not going to happen in this particular case. I'm not exactly sure in the background why that's not happening, because these do support VTP to a limited extent. They support VTP version 1 and 2, not VTP version 3, but still, for a CCNA candidate, pretty much all the VTP stuff you'd want to do is support on here, but not the dynamic learning of domain names. At the CCNA level, you have to learn about rapid spanning tree or rapid PVST. Unfortunately, these EtherSwitch modules only support 802.1d or PVST, normal PVST plus with 802.1d. They do not support rapid spanning tree. They do not support multiple spanning trees. And MST is something you have to learn to configure and troubleshoot at the CCNP level and above. One big feature that's missing from here, which is unfortunate because the CCNA a lot of times is going to hit you hard on this feature, is port security. When you're learning about switching, one of the features that they're going to expect you to know is port security, how to configure it, the various different keywords and gotchas that go along with port security. Unfortunately, this EtherSwitch module also does not support port security. Now, when you get up to the CCNP level, this big list here takes on even more relevance, as there's a lot more features that are not supported here. So, if you're at the CCNP level studying for your switch exam or beyond, like the CCIE level, and you need access to all these missing features, unfortunately, at that point, you're going to only have two options. Either get yourself a real physical switch, which is the ideal option. And there are ways that you can actually connect a real physical switch into your GNS3 topology if you need to do that. Or get your hands on L2 IOU. But even L2 IOU doesn't have all the things supported in a real switch. There are some features in L2 IOU that are not supported. So if you want the full range of everything, you're going to have a real physical switch. So now that we spent enough time on talking about what this thing can't do, let's take a look at what it can do. So we know now that any router that supports network modules will support this EtherSwitch module. So what I'm going to do, if I haven't already done this, I'm going to go to Edit and Preferences. Under Dynamips, I'm going to click on iOS routers. And now I want to add a new router, because if you had an EtherSwitch router, it would show up here. You would see it in this list, but we don't see one. So I'm going to click on New, and I'm going to use my existing image, 3725. In this particular case, I'm just going to say C3725, let's say EtherSwitch. But this is the key part right here. When adding this, you want to select this option where it says this is an EtherSwitch router. And actually by doing that, it changes the name for you. I didn't even need to change the name. So that is the critical component right there. If you don't select that, that EtherSwitch network module will not be available to you on the next screen. So we need to select that. And now when I hit Next, select the appropriate amount of memory, which I think is 256 for this particular image. And now you can see by default, it populates one of your network module slots with a 16-port EtherSwitch module. Now, if you want to, if 16 ports is not enough, you could populate it with another one. Or certainly, if you want to use this router for routing as well as switching, let's put in a 4-port serial card as well. And because this is a 3725, we have some WIC slots available. I'm just going to leave these empty because I don't care about those for this demonstration. And we're going to want to find an idle PC. And this is normal. Don't worry too much about this. We'll just have to wait for about 30 seconds or so. And then it should find an idle PC value for this particular platform. And there we go. It has found an idle PC value, which is what we were looking for. So click OK and Finish. And now we can see up in the available platforms, now we have, if I expand this a little bit, actually it won't let me, we have an EtherSwitch router. So click OK. So now in this particular topology, which is the topology we just saw in the last video, I'm going to accomplish the same thing, but this time I'm going to use the EtherSwitch router so I can have a little bit more experience configuring iOS switching commands. So click once again on your switching tab or switching button, and now we have an EtherSwitch router. So I'm just going to drag and drop that into place. Okay, and so let's go ahead and connect its interfaces. Now let's talk a little bit about its interfaces for just a second. I'll zoom in here. Because this is a 3725, the fast Ethernet interfaces that are on the main chassis, which you see here, are fast Ethernet 00 and fast Ethernet 01. Those are routed interfaces. Those do not belong to the switching module. So you have to look under, and you can see here which ones are included under the switching module. And if you see that, let's bring that up again. You can see that slot 1 has the network module with a 16-port ether switch. So in this particular case, ports 10 up to 115 will be my switching interfaces. That's where I will find those. So don't try to configure your switch port commands on the first couple of interfaces, because those fast Ethernet interfaces are router interfaces, not switching interfaces. Now this one, if I right click, I don't want to select configure. This is not like the built-in switch node that we saw before. I'm not going to configure this thing via a GUI. I'm going to configure it via the actual command line. So let's go ahead and start it up first, because I won't even get the command line if I don't start it. There we go. And let's go ahead and right click and select console. And here we are. Let's wait for it to boot up a little bit. Okay, now before I configure it, I can go ahead and add my connections at least using the link tool, so I'll click on that. So here I'll select the very first switching port, which is 1/0. I'll connect that to PC1, and I'll keep doing it with the other ones. And when I'm done here, I will move the port designators around a little bit so they are actually clear. All right, so that's that. Let's go ahead and move this guy so that everything lines up nicely. Okay, now I can see my interface designations a little bit more clearly at this point. Okay, so in the last video, in order to create our VLANs and create our trunks and assign it to the ports, it was all based on the GUI. Well, now I've actually got a router, so I have to go in there and configure that. So let's go ahead and start with Fast Ethernet 10 and 11. So because this is a router, I can actually use the interface range command. Interface range, Fast Ethernet 1/0 through 1/1. Switch port mode access, switch port access VLAN 1, no shut. Okay. Now let's go back to 1, 2, and 1, 3, and let's put those into VLAN 2. Switch port mode access, switch port access VLAN 2, and notice it created VLAN 2 just like you would see in a real switch. No shut, exit. Now if I want to create a VLAN on this thing, some of the earlier versions of GNS3 and the earlier versions of software said that in order to create a VLAN you had to go into VLAN database mode. And then from there type in your VLAN or whatever it was. But in reality you don't have to do that anymore. Here from the global configuration mode you can still create a VLAN. It works. Now the last step, I want to create my 802.1q trunk right here on Fast Ethernet 1/4. So notice when I do switch port mode, if this was a real switch, you'd have access to switch port mode dynamic, but that's not in right here. So I can't select that. So switch port mode trunk. Also notice that with just a regular switch port command, one thing that's missing is switch port security. The port security option is not available here, as I mentioned. No shut, exit. And before I leave here, you do have a variety of spanning tree commands available to you for practicing spanning tree and moving around your root bridge and practicing per VLAN spanning tree plus and all that good stuff. Now, one other thing that's sort of different in here. If you were in a real switch and you wanted to see what VLANs were available, you would just simply type show VLAN. Well, that's not the correct command. And actually, it tells you up at the very beginning, if I can go through there, when it first came up right here, it says to view existing VLANs, use the command show VLAN-switch brief. show VLAN-switch brief. And that's how I can see my VLANs, and the output is pretty much identical to the output you would see on a regular physical switch. Okay, so nothing's showing up under show interface trunk, which is a little bit suspicious. So let's take a look. According to my topology here, interface fast Ethernet 1/4 should be trunking. It's possible it's not coming up because the other end of the line is currently down. Router 1 right now is in a shutdown state, so that might be why fast Ethernet 1/4 is not coming up. So let's just bring everything else up, give it just a couple of seconds in the background for router 1 to finish loading. Show run interface fast Ethernet 1/4. Okay, switch port mode trunk, duplex full, speed 100. That looks good. It is not shut down. Show interface fast Ethernet 1/4. So what about the physical layer properties? Okay, so here we have a problem. Fast Ethernet 1/4 is up, but the line protocol is down. Most likely because something is not configured correctly on the router's side. So let's just go back to the router here and get that working. So here's my router. Show run interface fast Ethernet. Actually, let's do show run, and we'll begin at interface fast Ethernet 0/1. All right, speed is 100, full duplex. Looks like that should be okay. And our sub interfaces are correctly configured. Let's just take a look at the actual status of that interface. Okay, it says it's up. Line protocol is up. Now these EtherSwitch modules do support the Cisco Discovery Protocol, so show CDP neighbor. Okay, so we do have some problem here because router 1 is not seeing the EtherSwitch module. Let's just double check everything. So once again, start with the topology summary window. Is everything green? Do we see any red lights? Nope, everything's green. Everything says it's on. Okay, so I can get out of there. Verify that my interfaces are correct. So if I just hover over the switch, the EtherSwitch module, and take a look at the interfaces, let's see here. So it looks like, if I scroll over that again, okay, so fast Ethernet 1/4, we can see right down there, is connected to router 1 on port fast Ethernet 0/1. So that is correct. All right, let's save my project before I go any further. Sometimes what I've seen is you have to play around with the speed and the duplex of the interfaces to get everything lined up correctly. So even though we saw, let's go ahead and do this again. So we saw on router 1, let's do that again. Router 1, we see that he is full duplex 100 megabits per second, which I believe is the exact same thing as the EtherSwitch. Auto duplex, auto speed. Okay, so we're having a mismatch here because on one side it's hard-coded for full duplex and speed. On this side it is using auto negotiation. So let's just change that. Shut the interface down. Change the speed to 100. Change the duplex to full. No shut. And hopefully that will fix our problem. There we go. That looks good. Has become .1Q trunk. Show interface trunk. And now it confirms it, that our interface is actually in trunking state. So that concludes this particular video on the EtherSwitch module. As you can see, to recap what we talked about. Number 1, you have to select an iOS image for a router that supports network modules. And I showed you on the GNS3 website how to get to that page that specifically talks about the routers that support that. So get a hold of the correct iOS image. Number 2, import that iOS image into GNS3, and when you get to the appropriate screen, click that little box that says, this is an EtherSwitch module. That was required. Number 3, within GNS3 itself, once that router is there, once that switch is there, you can now go to the switching section and you'll see it available as an Ether switch router. Just drag and drop that into your topology. And then number 4, just go into the console of that, just like you would go into the console of any other router in your device, and start configuring the appropriate interfaces in the network module as switch ports, and configure your spanning tree and everything else that you need to do. So that concludes this particular video on how to use switching in GNS3.